Hi, folks. I am Mary Poplin with Boris FX. And today on Office Hours, we're going to be going over a little bit about screens. We're going to talk about some green screens, and we're going to talk a little bit about closing screens, screens that are moving off screen, and how to deal with challenging shots. We're going to talk a little bit too about like what you want to do and what you don't want to do when you're shooting your screens. So we'll talk a little bit about VFX souping, right? And planning your shots. We're going to be working in After Effects and showing Mocha Pro. If you have any questions, please put them into the chat. These work best when you're interactive with us. If you have any questions that don't get answered, you can always email me at maryp@borisfx.com. I'm the easiest person in the world to find. So we're doing these office hours every week on Tuesdays at 1 p.m. And the idea is that you can use these interactive sessions to have access to people like me, or maybe people like Ben or John eventually, who can sort of walk you through our products in real time. You know, with COVID and everything, we don't really have on-site visits like we used to. So we're really moving into this digital space. And we need your help to make these successful. So please like and subscribe, and we will be happy to continue to do these. All right, so I'm going to get started. All right, let's jump over to where you can see my screen. All right, so let's play this a little bit. We're working inside of After Effects, and you can see we've got this pad that we'd like to track. Well, there's a couple of things about this pad and the shooting of it that seems like the user tried to make themselves something that was easy for them, but they ended up making a process that's probably going to be harder for them. And that is this really bright green screen. There's a lot of spill coming from this screen because it's a light. So if you're going to do a green screen, I would suggest desaturating it quite a bit. And then in your comp, you can saturate and pull a key from there. Or you can do what they did on Dune, and you can start doing negative colors, right? Like they shot what they called sand screens, and they still had to do an absolute ton of roto. But because they took a hue that was the opposite of blue and put it on there, they were able to pull a cool color. And then when they had spill, it was the right color on the film. So what they did is they did an invert and then pulled the screens and then put that as the alpha. And then their foreground color was still a sort of warm color. Now you got to make sure when you do that, that you do a skin color, something that's different than skin color. I also recommend doing things like gray screens. I don't really recommend white screens because then you don't get any details. I see that I have a couple of people saying hi in the chat. Hi. I hope y'all are enjoying this. So what I suggest is using a gray screen, not white, not green. Or if you have to use green, desaturated green. What you really don't want to do is you don't want to shoot tracking markers, because then you're going to have, look at all these reflections on this screen. Having to repaint those over tracking markers stinks. And with Mocha, you can just track the edges of things. So I want to talk a little bit about more successful shots than trying to track this one. All right, this one here. So this screen is off. Hello there. All right, so this screen is off. So what's going on here is that we're getting all of those nice and beautiful reflections, and we're getting good edges. Okay, now that matters because this will be much easier to pull now, as far as tracking and as far as if we had something go over the top. Now, you can also use this dark screen as like a screen layer over the top of itself. And that gives you all those beautiful reflections back in the shot. And then another example really quick is this one. And we're gonna go over tracking all of these today. So this screen is white. Not as successful as I would like. I would like this to be a gray screen. But I got all of these shots for free. And I want to tell you really quick where I got those from. So if you've ever had trouble trying to find footage to practice on, and I know that's a problem for a lot of users, I'll tell you what a good website to check out is. We've got this website called Pexels. It's not ours. It's what I mean by we is like, we have access to this site called Pexels. It's a free footage site. It's also a free stock footage site. And you can go through and you can search for footage and you can try to build your own shots out of this. Now, one of the license agreements is that you have to be respectful about these pieces of footage. You can't do something that would make the talent in them feel uncomfortable, right? You've got to be polite. But in a lot of ways, you can use this footage for something interesting. So if you need free footage, go to Pexels. All right. So that's where I got all of these pieces from. So if you want to follow along with this, you can download these pieces of footage from Pexels and you can build your own project from this. All right. So let's talk a little bit about tracking. You can see that on the background here, they have put up a green screen. And I guess that's why they left the screen white. The nice thing about the screen being bright is that she's really careful that her finger doesn't really cross the white for very much. And for a lot of screens, you're going to have to do Roto anyway. The nice thing about this is that it casts light. So it casts light all over the screen and gives you a really realistic light interaction on the keyboard. I still probably would have made this gray, maybe a blue gray, maybe a green gray. But since the background is green, I probably would have went with blue gray. All right, so how do we track this shot? If y'all ever tracked a shot and had it close, had a screen close, and just not known how to deal with that, let's talk about that. We're going to go over to Effects and Presets and grab Mocha Pro. Drag and drop it right onto our timeline. What this will do is this will read our footage and we can click Launch. Again, I'm working inside of After Effects, but you can do this in a Mocha Pro standalone. You can do this in Silhouette even. You can do this inside of Nuke. You can do this inside of Avid and Premiere. Many pieces of software. All right, let's zoom in. And let's talk a little bit about how to track this. So I'm going to go to the end of this shot. Actually, let's think about this for a second. So we've got this lady's hand that moves over the front of the screen. I don't want to have that interrupt my track. So let's zoom out a little bit. Let's take a little solid circle shape. And let's just cut her thumb out here. And let's track this. We're going to call this thumb holdout, because in Mocha, you can use other shapes inside of Mocha to hold out from every shape that's beneath them. If you track from the foreground to the background, layer-wise, like objects closer to the camera need to be at the top of the layer pile, and objects further from the camera need to be at the bottom of the layer pile. That's how that works. You can use that data in order to create holdout masks so that your track doesn't get interrupted. We're going to track this just using translation. We don't need to do scale. And we're going to track backwards. And remember, y'all can ask questions as we go. I have a live chat right here. I see a couple of people have said hi, but if you have any questions about what we're doing, just go ahead and ask that in the chat and I'll answer it as we go. All right, so we're going to let this track. And because we're tracking translation only, it's just following the hand. We're not trying to get it to skew or shear or do any of that kind of motion. All right, I have no screen left to track here anymore. So I'm going to hit stop. I'm going to trim this layer right here in Layer Properties. And now that's going to vanish. All right, and now we're going to hit track forwards. And we're going to let that thumb get up and out of the way. And once the thumb is up and out of the way, we're going to trim the layer there too. And since this is just a holdout, we don't care about super accuracy. All we care about is that this hand is blocked because we're going to track this whole screen. Now you notice there are no tracking markers on this screen. Well, I talked a little bit about that earlier because we were talking about how you don't want to have to paint those. And again, I really would have made this screen gray because if you make it like 50% gray, you still get the light reflections, but you also get the screen reflections. So Grayson S is asking, and this is random, this is not related to this, is the camera solver a true 3D camera solve or is it something else? It's an object solver, okay? A true 3D camera solver looks for just a gazillion points. It tries to track them all, tries to give you an accurate camera based on what those points are, and then it gives you a scene that you can put objects into. The camera solver in Mocha Pro is kind of like the camera solver in After Effects. It's a location-based solver. So you can take a couple of, like a plane here and a plane here, use those two planes only to solve, and then as long as you stick an object on one of those planes, it will move correctly in the scene. But it's not a good way to get the data into a huge full 3D scene. Now that being said, if you have a shot that a camera tracker is having a hard time with, you can always slap some Mocha planes in there with no motion blur, render them with the insert module, and then what you can do is you can have a Mocha assisted true camera solve. So if you have a shot that you're really having trouble with, I recommend that as a hot tip. All right, let's go ahead and trim this layer. Very good. And let's scroll back. I have no idea what VUR FYI means, but in After Effects in general, is it best to have Mocha at the top of the effects stack? Yes. Okay. Whatever you need to do tracking and roto wise, you should probably do that before you process anything inside of After Effects. And in fact, when you're working with After Effects, make sure you pre-comp everything, move all attributes into that new composition, okay? Because you always want to envelope stuff inside of After Effects, especially when you're using effects, because they might conflict with one another. And you absolutely can't do things like retime before you apply Mocha. Hope that answers that question. All right, so we have this holdout mat for this finger, thumb, whatever. Okay, now we can start to track this screen. So let's call this thumb holdout and name your layers, especially if you're working with other people, because they won't appreciate not having them. All right, I'm going to use my little square tool here, and we are going to just relax the corners just a little bit, and I'm going to align it to the outside of my screen. And notice how I'm going a little bit outside the edges of my screen. All right, why am I doing that? Well, one of the reasons I'm doing that is because I want just a few little pixels of data that define the outside edge of the screen, because Mocha is a planar tracker and it's not looking for features. It's looking for a pattern of pixels and how that pattern of pixels moves through the scene. If I don't give it edges, it's going to have a harder time finding that data. We're going to use the Add to Explain tool, and I'm going to just go ahead and cut this middle out. All right, and what do I mean by cut the middle out? Let me turn this to a color you can see. Let's go with red. Okay, and let's turn my mat on. So do you see how, as my shape intersects itself, I get a cutout? As long as the shapes are on the same layer, they will hold out from themselves, okay? So this is gonna be my screen track, all right? And we're going to take this screen track and we're going to drag it underneath my thumb holdout. Okay, and that's because, let's just scroll back here. Do you see how that shape is held out from the mat? That's important. All right, so now we're going to track translation, scale, rotation, shear, and perspective. 50% should be fine. We can jump it up to 70 if we're feeling really squirrely. And I don't think that we're going to have to increase our search area, but let's see what we get when we track. These are live. I've never touched these shots before. And part of that is so that if the shot does mess up, we can talk about how to fix those things. Because a lot of the times we show you demos that are really short form and we pick shots that work really well. And the reason we do that is because we're trying to teach concepts. We're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. We're just trying to teach a specific concept, and we don't want to get too into the weeds. But these long form office hours are the place for the weeds. This is where you come to play in the weeds. So that's where we are right now. Now, I have another question in the chat that I'm going to talk about while we're looking at this track. When replacing a green screen background with an image, when I go to apply the tracking data to the image, when I go to apply the tracking data to the image, the background image shrinks and doesn't keep its scale. Okay, so that is going to be an aligned surface / mismatched resolutions issue. Okay, if you're trying to apply a background to a shot and the background is larger or smaller than the original plate that you tracked, you're going to have to do a couple of tricks inside of After Effects in order to get that to work. We have a tutorial on aligned surface and mismatched resolutions on the website that I've done. We also have something you might want to look into called the Mega Plates tutorial, because it's how to use oversized plates with a corner pin inside of After Effects. We're not going to cover that today because we won't have time to, but I can cover that next week if you like. Tyler, if you have a shot that you're having trouble with that we can troubleshoot live, can you email me at maryp@borisfx.com and I'll take a look at it and we'll see if we can solve a way to either use the oversized shot or to change the resolution of the background, okay? But basically, you either go to fit to comp and then pre-comp that and use that as your corner pin, or you use the option to move the object without rescaling it in your After Effects settings on your layer. All right, so while this tracks, let's stop this for a second. I want to align my surface tool to the corners of my screen here. All right, and the reason we want to do that is because we want to just make sure that this is dead accurate. Okay, and let's turn our matte off here. Okay, perfect. And hit track backwards. All right, I'm glad that helps, Tyler. And like I said, if you want me to troubleshoot the shot, just email it to me. And that goes for anyone that's watching that. Anyone watching this, if you have something you want me to troubleshoot live, just go ahead and send it to me. And we'll go over the concepts and we'll talk about how to make it better. All right, so while this is tracking, we're going to get to a point where Mocha's not going to be able to hold on anymore because we're tracking a pattern of pixels, okay? And as a pattern of pixels tilts towards the camera, you don't have any pixels left to track. So if there's nothing to track, trying to ask a tracker to do that, it's not going to work very well. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to hand track the last few frames of this with manual track in order to get it to close. And that's okay because usually that motion is so quick that you'll never see in 1,000 years that it's been hand corrected. So we have another question in the chat. How do you deal with badly grained footage? So we can have acceptable or good enough tracking data. Well, it really depends on how bad the grain is. Okay, if you have a super grainy piece of footage like night vision or I'm going to stop this track real quick because we're getting a problem. Actually, I'm going to let it go because we'll do a adjust track on this to fix it. Okay, if you have footage that's really, really, really grainy, you can jump your smoothing up, and that will put a blending mode over the top to try to find what the proper texture is underneath the footage. But you can also do things like use a degrain, something like neat image. Anytime you do processing like that, though, you're going to be blowing away part of the texture data. So you might end up having to do something like use adjust track to get past grainy objects. So if you have too much grain and you're seeing a little bit of a wobble, you can either jump smoothing up and then use adjust track, or you can use neat image and then try to fix that after the fact. All right, so let's talk about this for a second. We really start to lose it. And I don't like how much we're losing this. So let's try a couple of things. So one of the first things I'm going to try is cheating. Okay, so this is our last good frame. I'm going to turn perspective off. And let's try. That did not work. Okay, so let's try this. Let's try pulling our shape over and animating our shape a little bit. We're going to say, hey, shape, you're kind of doing the wrong thing. I want you to look here. And you're kind of looking in the wrong place. So we'll move our shape, because if you remember from any of my previous talks about, how tracking works, the shape is where the track is looking, and the surface tool is what the track is doing. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and make a keyframe here. We're just going to keyframe our shape a little bit. And because we're on auto keyframe, anytime I move the shape, let me turn this bounding box off. Anytime I move the shape, it makes a keyframe for me, because right over here in auto key, I have auto key turned on. And let's just, again, correct this a little bit. So we're going to tell the track to look into these little places right here. And we're going to say, while you're looking here, go ahead and keep tracking. All right, so let's change to perspective. All right, and let's hit track backwards and see what we get. So we might get something that looks a little bit better, because we're changing where the track is looking, right? Just like this. All right, looking good. Ooh, and it's holding on way better. All right, let's move this shape down a little bit. And let's keep tracking. It's nice when stuff works out. All right, so we're still losing the top a little bit, but that's okay, because we'll use adjust track on that. And again, we'll just move this shape down, and we'll keep tracking backwards. All right, now we're starting to totally lose it. We don't have too much more to deal with past that. So let's try turning to shear only for a minute. Nah, that's not going to do it. Okay, so we've lost just about what we can track. So that's our last good frame. Let's go to the dope sheet, go into our screen track. We're going to talk a little bit about massaging tracks. All right. That's our last good frame. So on my screen track, which is right here, I'm going to just go ahead and delete my track to there. So you see I've just deleted all these top keys, which deleted all of the keyframes below. Okay. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to make sure that on my last frame, that my surface tool is exactly where I want it. Okay? And let's see where we start to lose it. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our parameters. We're going to go to adjust track. We're going to say we need a 4-point correction on this. And we are going to set those points. And now we can say, set this as a reference frame. Okay, this is the button we need to click. Let's look for our last good frame before we start the turn. All right, now let's select our points. And let's just make sure that these are exactly where they need to be. And you can see we have a reference frame and a current frame right here. And what we can do is we can use this to make a 4-corner correction. So this should be perfect. Yeah, it is. So it's perfect up until that point. All right, and now we need to adjust. So now let's go all the way to here. Our last good frame. And I want to say right there. Okay, and now we're going to correct this again. So we're going to bring these points exactly where I want them. All right, that's just about right, but we're going to nudge it over. Okay, and this one we are also going to nudge over. And if you're ever curious as to whether or not it's lining up correctly, you can look at the side of the surface as well. Okay? So now, let's see what we got. So we still need to do a couple more corrections at the top. So let's just nudge this over. There we are. All right, and to the right side as well. Bring it up and over. All right, let's make sure the top still looks good. It doesn't. So where is it the most different? About here. Okay. Correcting tracks. It's like watching paint dry. All right. There we are. All right, we're almost done. And then we can start correcting into the turn. All right, you don't want to have too many keyframes that are too close together, because if you do, your adjust track will jitter, which is not what you want. All right, so now we should be able to go to the end of our turn here, which is, I want to say about here. And let's see. Yeah, let's just adjust. Oops. If you do too much of an adjustment too quick, it'll put the surface behind the camera and you won't be able to correct anything. All right. And then the last frame here, we can't see the screen anymore. So we're going to just turn that off. All right, and we'll just correct these corners. So we could either do this with manual track or we could do it with adjust track. Adjust track tends to work just a little bit better because it gives you a little bit more control, because we just recently redid the entire adjust track module. All right, so now we have a very nicely tracked screen. Okay, so someone is asking, in this scenario, would you recommend a few small tracking dots in the black border around the screen? Maybe tips on what to optimize the tracking process. I actually don't, Because if you put tracking markers in there, now you have to paint them out. And that is no fun at all. Even if they're just little dots, they interrupt the reflection, and this is a highly reflective surface. So there is no really good way to get past the data of closing, because there's no points that would really fix that. And the amount of plater data that you have left to track is pretty low. So anytime you have something where something is closing completely, the last couple of frames, you are just going to have to hand track. Okay. And the reason for that is because there's just nothing left to track, whether you're tracking points, features, or planes. So, and I definitely wouldn't want to give myself more paint work. It's just easier to do it this way, in my opinion. I mean, you can do it however you want to, but in this way, I have a screen that I can composite the whole time, and I don't have to do any paint. All right. Now, I have one more thing that I probably need to do, and that is roto this thumb. Okay, so we're going to save this. We've got 30 minutes left. And I'm going to find where my thumb is the most crisp, and it looks like it's a little bit out of focus the whole time. So we're just going to pick this frame. And I'm going to do a little roto shape right around this thumb. Now we could try to key this, but again, like I said when I started this, if you put a green screen on here, then you've got to deal with green spill, and it's a whole thing. All right. So let's call this thumb roto. We're going to turn our screen track off. We're going to take thumb roto, and we're going to just link it to the thumb holdout track. We're going to use our auto stabilize or quick stabilize mode. We're going to keep this right in the center of our screen. Actually, I bet we can get Mocha to track this without having to link it. Let's go to thumb roto, and let's just have Mocha track this. Let's do translation, scale, rotation, and shear. I don't really recommend tracking perspective when you're tracking for rotoscoping. Let's hit track backwards, see what it does for me. Yeah, that's better. Whatever way that you can get the computer to take the amount of work out for you, go ahead and do that. Let's be lazy. All right. I don't need the thumb past here. All right. And let's go to here and let's hit track forwards. And again, we're not going to track this past where we need it. So we're just going to track it until it doesn't cross the plane of the screen anymore. And then we don't care. So close. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to hit stop, and we're going to correct this shape. This is a good time to use the transform tool. Let's see if it'll turn on for me. It's not turning on for me. It's very annoying. Whatever. Well, that feels like a frustrating bug. Okay, let's we'll double check that. I think that's something we know about. Okay. Now, let's go over here. And let's move this over here. There we are. And let's just adjust these points real quick. And again, adjust these points real quick. Ah, rotoscoping. Doesn't everybody love it? All right. Here we are. Adjust these points. And now we've got a rotoscoped thumb. Looks like we need to adjust these points. All right, so I'm going to save this. We're going to zoom out. All right, I see a question over here. I'm trying to simplify and flip a logo around on a microphone in a radio studio. Mocha picks it up well. How would you suggest I flip the logo on the mic and track it? I would just track the logo and then make a little cutout for the logo itself, flip it, correct it. Do you have all four corners at all four corners of a comp the same size as the comp you're tracking? And then just go ahead and paste the corner pin on there, or use the insert module to put it right back on top. And I'll show you what we mean here with the insert module in just a second. All right, so if we want to put a image on this screen, let's talk a little bit about that. So there's a couple of ways we can do that. We can take our Mocha track and we can go to export our tracking data. If you're going to work in After Effects, you should probably use After Effects CC Power Pin. It supports motion blur. It's just a really good corner pin to use inside of After Effects. If you're inside of Nuke, then you probably want to use the Nuke corner pin. And there's just about a zillion other formats we support here. So you could copy that to the clipboard and paste that in. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to actually use the insert module. So I'm going to save this really quick and close it. And then I'm going to save my After Effects file, because your plugin is not saved until your host file is saved. Okay, so make sure that you save. Save early, save often, save in intervals. Don't cut off autosave. I've had users tell me, like, I lost 2 days of work. It's like, there is never a time that you should be going 2 days without saving. Okay, so here we go. Let's go over to our project. And there's a shot I want to put on the screen. Okay, yeah. So I've got this little dancer video. I just thought it was interesting looking. So I'm going to drag this underneath my footage, and you can see that it's the same size as my comp. This will matter. Okay. So we're going to take our plugin interface. Thank you. I left the word there for a minute. Okay. And we're going to go to our insert layer. Insert layer. I'm going to select this bottom layer. Okay. And we're going to go to insert composite. All right. And let's launch Mocha. What this will do is this will allow me what I see is what I get situation. All right. Now, on my screen track, I'm going to say insert clip, insert layer. And now I can see my screen right here on my laptop. All right. I'm going to go over to my insert module and I'm going to say, hey, render this with motion blur. And we can even change our blending modes. So let's go to multiply. All right. And that will probably get it a little more into our light profile in this shot. Okay. Because now I'll have all of my screen data over the top. We're going to save this and we're going to close it. All right. And so now in Mocha, in my After Effects, I should be rendering this back to the timeline. Let's go to insert composite and render. There we go. So now I've got my track and it's right on my screen. And it's rendering with motion blur. All right, but there's a couple of things that I need to fix about this comp. One of the things is this thumb. We don't want a blue thumb over the top of everything. So let's take my Mocha project and let's duplicate this layer. Let's call this, we're going to name our layers, thumb. Okay. Now, I'm going to go into my module renders. I'm going to turn them off. I don't want to render for this. What I do want is a matte. I want to apply the matte. I can also create AE masks, but if I apply the matte, I can actually apply motion blur to it. So let's go to visible layers. And let's turn only my thumb roto on. All right. So now my thumb is held out. If I launch Mocha, because this is Mocha Pro, I have access to motion blur generated off the track. So what we'll do is let Mocha launch. There we go. Start. I need to upgrade clearly. And let's go over to our motion blur. Let's turn Uber key on and add motion blur. We're going to save and close. And now this will render with motion blur. And if I feel like the matte edge is too harsh, I can add a feather of like 2 pixels. All right, which looks good. Let's fit it. So now I've got my screen and I've got my video on my screen. Now I have one more thing that I tend to suggest. It looks like we need to actually take the surface and make it slightly larger. But I have one more thing I tend to suggest, which is getting your reflections back. And to those of you who are just joining us, hi, I see you. Thanks for joining us. All right, let's hit duplicate on this. And let's call this reflections. Okay, and let's see if we can pull any reflections out of this. I'm going to just delete my Mocha shape, or my Mocha instance, and I'm going to look for saturation. We can use either the saturation that comes with After Effects, or we can use the Boris FX one. Let's take saturation down to -100. All right, so no saturation. Now, let's find levels. All right, and here's levels. And let's see if we can just see any reflections. We can, good. Any reflections on that screen. So this is why I suggest doing things like using a gray screen and not white. If you use white, you hardly see any reflections. But anyway, let's screen this right over the top. And let's blur it. Let's do a smart, actually, let's do a box blur because they're fast. Fast box blur. That's true. It is fast. All right. And let's increase the blur on that. Maybe to 15. Maybe to 5. Yeah, okay, that's a little bit better. All right, and let's take that down to like 50%. All right, so now let's put that underneath our thumb and let's hit play. And now what we should have is something that looks like a fairly completed comp from a pretty difficult track. Let's see how this looks. Let's go to further down the shot. Okay. So I'm feeling like so far so good. And the nice thing is that we can always go back and correct stuff. So I noticed that I'm losing, because of motion blur, I'm losing a little bit of the top and edge of my frame. So we can correct that really easily. Let's go back into our Mocha. We're going to call this screen replace. Okay, back in Mocha, we're just going to launch Mocha, and then we're going to change the surface tool. What I like about this workflow, instead of using a corner pin, is I don't have to blow away a corner pin and redo it. What I see is what I get. So if I come over here to my screen track and my insert, and I zoom in here, what we can do is we can increase the size of this just a little bit. And so now when we save and close, we won't have any edge problems anymore. And because we're using a blending mode, you won't ever tell. So now let's hit play. We should have a slightly better comp. And I'm still feeling like the motion blur is pulling down too much. So I might take the motion blur off. So let's launch Mocha. There we are. Yes, I know I need to update. Thank you. Okay, so let's go back into our insert. Let's turn motion blur off. Okay, save and close. And let's go back. Yes. So now we're not getting any of that sort of odd blend. So what I might do to finish this is that, well, I guess we need to clear our cache. But anyway, what I might do at the end of this is I might go in and do something like force a motion blur over the top of this to make this comp right. All right. So there's ways to get around this. I do want to talk about one more shot while we still have time. Let's just save this. Let's jump over to a different shot. This shot. All right. So this shot is a little bit complicated. And one of the reasons it's complicated is because I don't really have 4 corners to track here. And so this kind of throws folks off. But it's actually really not too hard to do. So let's come over to our Mocha effect. Let's drag and drop it right onto our timeline. If y'all are just joining us, this is office hours. We've got about 15 minutes left. If you want to ask any questions, ask them in the chat and I'll answer them if I can. If not, we might have to dedicate something to next week if it's a more in-depth question. That being said, like and subscribe because we're trying to do these every week, Tuesdays at 1 o'clock EST. All right, let's launch Mocha. As usual, it's going to read right from the timeline. There we are. And now let's zoom in. All right, so this is what I'm talking about when I say shooting with the screen off or a gray screen is good because look at all these beautiful reflections. That's really going to help me sell my comp, okay? Let's find where the object is largest in frame, least blurry, and most parallel to the camera. That's going to be right here. And I'm going to make a little U shape right around the screen to track. And notice I'm giving myself as much data as I can that's planar, okay? There's a reason for that. It's because I don't have a lot of data here. So now let's take our surface tool. Let's align it to this bottom corner left and this bottom corner right. And this as well. All right. Now, we can come over to our track and track perspective. Now let's hit track forwards. Actually, this corner needs to come down perspective-wise. Actually, let's check. Okay, let's make this as parallel as possible. So if we come over here, I want to show you a trick. It's called perspective, and it's an art trick. Okay, we want to make sure at the bottom of that screen and this line here are pretty parallel. Okay, so now, if I do this, now I have a little bit more of an idea of what that should look like. So something like that. I can see that we have a lot of lens warp in this shot, so we're going to do our best guess. We could solve for a lens, but I'm not going to do that today. Let's hit track forwards because we've only got 10 minutes left. All right, but the nice thing about this is that even though we don't have all 4 corners on screen, it doesn't matter because this is a really good illustration of what planar tracking means, okay? Because we have all of the data for the bottom part of this screen, we also have the data for the top part because mathematically, the difference between the middle of the screen and the bottom of the screen is the same relationship as the middle of the screen to the top of the screen. It's all the same planar data. So it doesn't matter that all 4 corners aren't on the screen. We're tracking one plane. And that's where this kind of starts to be really useful instead of using something like a feature tracker or a point tracker, because this would be kind of difficult with a point tracker. With a point tracker, you could do something like track this inside corner and this inside corner, this inside corner and this inside corner, and then try to get the relationship between all of those. But because they're so close together, you're probably not going to get a very good track. So this type of track figures out the math that the whole plane is doing, and then it generates a surface tool, and that's going to be your corner pin. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm not sure. I hope it does. The whole point of planar tracking, I mean, at this point, planar tracking is not new. You know, we've been around for a long time, but a lot of times people aren't used to using it because they use it as a fire extinguisher and they don't really understand the way it works. As long as you think of it in terms of recording the math of how geometry is moving, you sort of have got it. If you think of it in terms of points and features, you don't got it. You don't often need to add points and features. Often the texture of the back of an arm is enough to track. The back of a hand, the side of somebody's face, okay? If somebody's moving a whole lot and you have a whole lot of motion blur, yeah, okay. Then maybe use tracking markers. You know, there was a sci-fi show that we got used on a lot, and they did a really clever set of tracking markers. They did little marker dots, okay? Not X's, not anything that was hard to paint out. Something that you could literally paint out with like a little tiny shape and an offset, okay? Those were really successful shots because they gave themselves just a little bit of tracking data on organic features. Now, for things like screens, I don't necessarily recommend tracking points unless the screen is moving so wildly that you have no alternative and you can't find the corners. So consider that screens all kind of have their own built-in tracking markers because they have corners that you can always find. So just think about that. All right, guys, we're almost done with this track. And we can slap something on top of it, and I'll show you how it looks. We've got just about 5 minutes left, so if you've got any questions that you have, now is the time to ask them. All right, so that's my track. And see, this would seem like a difficult track, but Mocha just nailed that. All right, so now let's just put like a little grid on it. If we ever want to check our track, the grid tool is a great way to do that. And it's right over here in your insert clip. We have all these default clips that you can put in, okay? And this default clip is a grid, and it lets you see if you need to do any sort of adjustments. All right, so now we could take this and we could do that same sort of insert. So we could go to an insert clip and set it as insert layer. We could save this and close it, and we could apply that data. The other thing we can do is we can apply a corner pin. So let's go to a new solid. I'm just going to pick any solid. Okay, and I'm going to select my Mocha layer. You don't have to just copy and paste tracking data from the plugin. You can also do it from the plugin interface. So let's go to my tracking data. We're going to say I want a CC power pin, and I want to apply it to my red solid. And we're going to create our track data from layer 1. Okay. Now we're going to apply our export. And that's our corner pin, just like that, right on our screen. So you can either use the insert module or you can use corner pins. And you can do that either by exporting the data outside of the plugin and copying and pasting, or you can apply it via the plugin interface. The plugin interface is probably the more foolproof option. And that's because if you paste your data, a lot of times users aren't paying attention to what frame they're on. Well, if you have data that should have been pasted on at frame 1 and you posted in at frame 60, that's going to be a problem. It's going to be 60 frames offset. And as ever, if you're ever having trouble tracking something and having the data not line up, take your shot, go to Layer, go to Pre-Compose, move all attributes into the new composition, and adjust the composition duration to the time span of the selected layers. Okay, if you do that, you can then apply Mocha to that, and it will always be self-contained as a shot. I can't tell you how often I see shots from users that look like this. Let me just drop some of these in here. Yeah, okay, here's one. We'll trim it to here. We'll take another shot, do this, trim it to here. Okay, and then they'll try to track this without encapsulating it. And what you end up with is you end up with something that doesn't line up because it's all different lengths in the shot. So inside of After Effects, just understand that when you have a clip that's a certain length, Mocha is going to treat every other layer that you're applying data from that clip to as the same format and frame rate and frame length. So encapsulate, especially if you're sending something from Premiere, like with Dynamic Link, just encapsulate everything in a pre-comp before you even start working. All right. I have one more question and then we're going to wrap this up. How come when exporting data to a layer, it disappears off the screen to the right, no matter what the size of the pre-comp, it doesn't pin to the tracked area? Okay, that's because, once again, your insert is probably larger or smaller than the original footage. So that's going to be a mismatched resolution problem. And that is the most common problem that we see with Mocha users is they'll try to apply a corner pin and they'll apply it to either an object that's too big or too small. And when you apply the corner pin, it assumes that the insert is the same size as the comp, if it's not, or what. And when it's not, when you paste that data in, it's offset. So you either need to fit that to the comp, or you need to figure out a way to get that data to be the same size. One of the recent issues I've seen, and we talked about this at the last office hours, was a face that they were trying to put onto a stop motion doll. And the face was in a 4K piece of footage, but the face was right in the middle, not to the edges. So when you applied a corner pin, the corner pin took that whole piece and corner pinned it down to the face. And this shrinking that happened made the face like this big inside of the face as opposed to the corners of the face. And that's always what you have to think about when you're trying to align your data. So I hope that helps. It works the same whether you're in After Effects or Mocha Pro, whether you're in Nuke, whether you're in Mocha for After Effects. This resolution issue is just a corner pin issue, okay? All right, guys. That is it for office hours. I really appreciate you tuning in. If you have any more questions, you can email me at maryp@borisfx.com. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We're doing these every Tuesday at 1 p.m. And I will see you next week.